Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you the Oracle and Voidweaver updated talents for the War Within. If you missed it, Oracle was based around Power Infusion and since has been removed, so let's go over really quick what the heck is going on. Oracle is shared, by the way, between Holy and Disc Priest. Instead of changing Power Infusion, Premonition is now a 1-minute cooldown that cycles between 3 different abilities. You're having Piety, which is increasing your healing done, and causes half your overhealing on players to be redistributed to up to 3 nearby allies for 10 seconds. This can be really insane, particularly for Disc, but keep in mind each spell is rotating through the available ones. The other ones are Insight, which reduces the cooldown of your next 3 spell casts by 5 seconds. Premonition of Solace, which causes your next single target heal to increase your target's healing received by 25% for 10 seconds. You have Miraculous Recovery, which can give you powered life on a reduced cooldown, and you can use it on targets below 50%. Premonition can also have Waste No Time, which causes your next heal, prayer of healing, or radiance to be instant cast. Preemptive Care is the same as it was before. A number of these are the same as they were before, where you increase the duration of Atonement and you renew. You have increased damage absorbed and increased healing done by Shield and Prayer of Mending, respectively. You are also applying additional stacks of Prayer of Mending when you cast Shield. You're getting a smaller shield value when you cast Prayer of Mending. There's a number of the crossovers that still exist. There's the Double Feather, there's reduced cooldown of Purify, there's the increased damage reduction for Pain Sup, and the increased duration for Guardian Spirit. Then Fatebender, instead of it being if you give one buff to somebody else and you give one buff to another person, you alternate. Now it's rewarding you for alternating the different buffs that you have on hand. And Narrowed Visions makes it so that the abilities don't cycle anymore until you actually hit Premonition, but you also gain an extra charge along the way. That also means, unfortunately, that for some of these less powered abilities, you're then going to have to actually hit those abilities instead of dodging them entirely. You have the reduced cooldown reduction, and there's a couple abilities that are under construction and not yet implemented. Grand Reveal is still there, where Shield and Prayer of Mending consumption is giving stacks, which eventually gives a Premonition charge. So let's talk about Oracle for Holy and Disc. Oracle is cycling between these different abilities unless you take the ability which gives you an extra charge, but I also think that one's pretty bad. Premonition of Solace, which is the increased healing version, is just very bad, just in general. Having more healing onto one individual target most of the time is just not that valuable. Being able to have overall healing and overhealing transfers are extremely valuable with Piety. And Insight can be kind of middling. If you're playing Holy Priest, you're going to accumulate 15 seconds worth of cooldown reduction for Sanctify and Serenity, depending on how you use the abilities. It also forces you to use them in specific ways to get value out of them, and it's extra work to sort of catch the correct buff. If you wanted to run with Narrowed Visions, which gives you the additional charge, but it only rotates through the different abilities, whenever you activate Premonition, whenever you activate the ability, it cycles to the next one. Then the problem is, then you have to go with a weaker power-up in Premonition of Solace to buff your single target healing on somebody you may not want to, in order to have 2 charges where you could like pair together Piety and Insight. You know, because you might want to be able to have a healing increase, and you might want to reduce the cooldown of a couple abilities. If you're playing Disc, for example, let's say that you are running with the double charges. Optimal setup might look like using Premonition of Solace in downtime and then accumulating both charges of Piety and Insight so that while you're about to deal damage, you're then going to activate Piety and then activate Insight and then reduce the cooldown of like your Mind Blast and your Penance and maybe your Penance again or something along those lines, so that you're able to get additional damage out, additional inescapable torment damage with your squid, something along those lines. Yeah, I guess. But it's additional abilities you have to add into the equation. If you didn't want to be forced into always using every single Premonition ability, then you'd have to catch when you would get the optimal ability. Let's say you wanted Piety as a Disc Priest while ramping. Every single GCD you're casting is cycling between the buffs. And so around the time where you hit your Evangelism, then you need to make a decision and be watching this buff to be able to see when it goes to Piety in between your Mind Blast, your Penance, and like follow up Smite cast or whatever to catch and activate Piety for the healing increase, for the overheal protection, and then make sure that you're not getting the wrong ability in the process. All of this while dealing with about a minute cooldown and all the different abilities you already need to apply as Disc Priest. This ability does not feel too fun. It doesn't feel too fun when it's activating it as a Disc Priest for a ramp. Even as a Holy Priest, it feels like the concentration of like increased healing or output is kind of just, if you catch it at the right times, it will be. It seems like a needless complication for something that's supposed to be like a slight power increase. If this was going to be like a massive thing, not just, 5% healing and, some overheal protection, if it was going to be like a massive power up the way like Velen's was back in the day for your disc ramps, I mean, that was like macroed in more or less into your abilities, right? And so this feels like extra complication. It still has that catch requirement like we had seen previously with Power Infusion. This time it's nice because it's based off your abilities that you're casting, but it's still such a frequent cooldown that it's kind of irritating to play around. I would much rather that Oracle play around like a 3-minute cooldown and have it feel more powerful as a result, rather than these like quick 1-minute burst CDs at your disposal. I think those are like watered down almost, where it's like you require extra work to be able to get value out of it, and then the extra value doesn't really feel that good. So I'm still pretty stinker on Oracle Priest for both Holy and for Disc. I think it's really sick being able to have like Miraculous Recovery. I like that a lot. I like Powered Life at a higher health threshold to be able to use. That sounds sick. But otherwise, it just feels bad. For the Holy Priest fans out there technically is an Archon tree in Alpha right now, but it doesn't actually have anything there. So we're going to switch our focus to Voidweaver, which is shared between Disc and Shadow Priest, and this thing is insanely OP. Oh my goodness gracious, man. This is ridiculously OP. Mind Blast tears open an Entropic Rift that follows the enemy for 10 seconds, and if it dies, it just stays where it is. Enemies caught in its path suffer 11k shadow damage every second while within its reach. The fun thing about this is that, yes, it does convert into Atonement Healing, and yes, it is uncapped, which means that if you get surrounded by a bunch of bad guys, you cast one Mind Blast, and it pulses this pool on the floor, which does damage to them, and it heals you for a crazy amount. So, yeah, this ability, real good. A lot of nerfs gonna come in for this. Dark Energy, while Entropic Void is active, you move 20% faster. No Escape. The Rift slows enemies by up to 80%, increase the closer they are to its center. Pretty sick. Void Blast, this replaces Smite. So after you Mind Blast, you put out this Rift, and then when the Rift is active, your Smite becomes Void Blast. Still the same like cast time and everything, just a awesome animation of blasting people with Void. And it does quite a nice amount of damage. Also, it does it as shadow damage too, which is really important for our Shadow Covenant. Inner Quietus, Powered Shield absorbs 20% additional damage. This is actually a buff that you get, and it also runs out. It's a really like short duration buff that I found. Didn't like that. Devour Matter, Shadow Word Death consumes absorbed shields from your target, dealing up to 300% extra damage to them, and granting you 1% mana if a shield is present. I was gonna say this ability feels kind of useless, but then I went through the only dungeon that we could go through on Alpha, and that last boss had an absorb. So if there's more of those, this ability could be pretty sick. Void Empowerment, summoning a Rift empowers your next shield to be 80% more effective. This was the one that had a short duration on it. You pretty much ended your Rift and then the buff ended. So hopefully they have a longer duration for that next time. Darkening Horizon, Void Blast, which again is your Smite, increases the duration of a Rift by 1 second up to a maximum of 5 seconds. So you're going to be casting Smites anyway, and it's pretty good as an upgrade. Void Wraith transforms your Shadow Fiend into a Void Wraith that casts Void Flay, dealing up to 50% additional damage, dealing more damage to higher health enemies. What's interesting about this is that if you run Shadow Fiend or Mindbender, right, it turns it into the Void Wraith all the same. And the Void Wraith is always a 2-minute cooldown. At least at the moment, I don't know if it's a bug. Damage that the Void Wraith is dealing with its Flay also does not convert into Atonement Healing whatsoever. So it's kind of an odd thing. Depth of Shadows, where your Shadow or Death has a high chance to summon a Shadow Fiend for 5 seconds, and the chance is increased against lower health targets. This Shadow Fiend doesn't proc Shadow Covenant, but it would proc like Inescapable Torment. So it's a little odd how some of these things are working, at least at the moment for Disc. Embrace the Shadow, pretty sick. You absorb 3% of all magic damage taken, and absorbing shadow damage heals you for 100% of the amount absorbed. That could be pretty prominent depending on the boss fights that we're going to be going into, so that'd be sick. Void Leech, this I love. Every 2 seconds, siphon an amount equal to 3% of your health from a nearby ally if they're higher health than you. I love the idea of this. Void Infusion. Atonement healing with Void Blast is 100% more effective. Okay, so again, Void Blast is your smite. And so keep in mind, Void Blast turns your smite into a shadow spell during Shadow Covenant, most of the time, we can assume. So it does more damage because it's going to be in Shadow Covenant, and it's increasing the duration of the Rift, which we'll explain in a second why that's important. And its Atonement healing is 100% more effective. Also keep in mind, while your Rift is active, your Atonement healing in general is more effective as well. So you have 2 abilities on hand which are really ramping up your burst output, and it's all cooked into Mind Blast. There's also some things that are cooked into Penance, which is the final ability, Collapsing Void. Each time Penance damages or heals, it should say during the Entropic Rift, the Rift is expanded by 1 yard. So each time that a Penance bolt hits the target, okay? So if the Rift is at 0, 4 Penance bolts, it expands it a little bit more. And after the Rift ends, it collapses, dealing 13k shadow damage up to 8 times to a random enemy, based on how many times it expanded. So if you're getting all these Penance bolts into the Rift, it expands the Rift, which could expand the range of enemies that it's hitting, which all converts into Atonement healing. And it's also firing off bolts as like an end martyrdom, which also converts into more Atonement healing. It's crazy. The actual gameplay of this is just crazy insanity. The ability's probably going to get nerfed quite a bit before we end up getting it to live, because it is just too good as it stands right now. When you hit your Mind Blast, you're deploying this Rift and you're casting abilities which are then getting empowered. It's kind of like the natural next step to, honestly, pet gameplay, I would say. You already have your Mindbender out all the time. Now you're having something that does more AoE damage. I'd imagine they're going to cap off the AoE damage for Atonement conversion or in some meaningful way. I can't imagine that staying, but being able to have an option that also increases your damage when the mob is higher health is really sick. I'd love it if Depth of Shadows, which was the Shadow or Death proccing a Shadow Fiend, if that also contributed to your Shadow Covenant uptime in a meaningful way. This is kind of a perfect like graduation, taking into account the loss of Season 3's tier set bonus, because with that tier set bonus gone, you're obviously going to have less Shadow Covenant uptime. And so having something that increases your base output by a pretty meaningful amount and then makes it so that your pet uptime is going to be, you know, rarer, but you're still having additional resources to be able to crank really big output sounds really nice. It also means that by having it as a longer cooldown, having something like your Mindbender or Shadow Fiend being a longer cooldown because you're not having as much haste, you're not having the double tap smites, that's okay as long as there's other ways that your abilities are meaningfully empowered. And being able to have synergy between Shadow Covenant pet uptime and making your smite turn into a shadow spell to make up for the lost Shadow Smite that you're losing from Season 3's tier set in Emirjasil, that sounds freaking fantastic. This setup is way overpowered at the moment, and I'm sure it's going to be nerfed. There's a couple of bug reports that I've already put in for things that working with Atonement, not working with Atonement, and having some inconsistencies that you have on hand. But I love that this does not add extra abilities or bloat to the table. It empowers abilities that you're already using on hand, and it's just going to be really flexible for a raid or a Mythic Plus environment because it's tied into your Mind Blast. And so you were already using your Mind Blast, coupled with Schism, whenever you needed to actually orchestrate good output, good healing, whatever, right? And now you have an additional way to provide a little bit of decent utility by having a slow going out onto everybody, and also be able to really crank output outside of your pet uptime. It seemed like in most of Dragonflight, if you had Shadow Covenant up, you were more powerful than the damage that the enemies were throwing at you. You could overheal night and day, you'd heal through everything. But without the Shadow Covenant uptime, you felt very vulnerable. I remember on like Khajiit in Halls of Infusion, where everybody's health starts ticking down, ticking down, ticking down, and I can't do anything about it until I get my Shadow Covenant to pump everybody's health up. So you may not have as much like feast and famine going into the War Within as Disc with a talent like this, which contains quite a lot of power, and even after they nerf it, which I'm sure they're going to, it's still going to contain a lot of power based on how it's amplifying our setup, and it might make the Shadow Covenant uptime that we do get feel even stronger than before, which is a really huge positive because we're not having as much uptime. And so you're trading more uptime for more meaningful uptime. At least that's the idea that I have thus far. It's super fun. Thus far, I haven't seen any specific talent changes for Disc or for Holy on their respective trees, but as there are going to be more changes, we're going to have so much coverage going over all the things for the War Within healing. So make sure you keep it here. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Check out joining as a member if you'd like to support further. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know what y'all think of Voidweaver and Oracle.